Hey folks, I know I look a sight. I'm getting ready to go wash my hair, so I just flop this. This is my caftan though I was talking about. I'll show you more of it in the live today at 3. Okay, this is chapter 25, part 2, and it's kind of long, so I'm not sure I'll get it all in. I went down today on purpose to see her have one. David was talking about Milty Bolter's cat that had fits. Terrible. But the mean old thing wouldn't take a fit and just kept healthy as healthy. Though Milty and me hung around all afternoon and waited, but never mind. Davy brightened up as the insidious comfort of the plum jam stole into his soul. Maybe I'll see her in one sometime yet. It doesn't seem likely she'd stop having them all at once when she's been so in the habit of it, does it? This jam is awful nice. Davy had no sorrows that plum jam could not cure. Sunday proved so rainy that there was no stirring abroad, but by Monday everybody had heard some version of the Harrison story. The school buzzed with it, and Davy came home full of information. Marilla, Mr. Harrison has a new wife. Well, not exactly new, but they've stopped being married for quite a spell, Milty says. I always supposed people had to keep on being married once they'd begun, but Milty says no. There's ways of stopping if you can't agree. Milty says one way is just to start off and leave your wife, and that's what Mr. Harrison did. Milty said Mr. Harrison left his wife because she throwed things at him. Hard things. And Artie Sloan says it was because she wouldn't let him smoke, and Ned Clay said it was because she never let up scolding him. I wouldn't leave my wife for anything like that. I'd just put my foot down and say, Mrs. Davy, you just got to do what'll please me, 'cause I'm a man, and that settled it pretty quick, I guess. But Anita Clay says she left him because he wouldn't scrape his boots at the door, and she doesn't blame her. I'm going right over to Mr. Harrison's this minute to see what she's like. Davy soon returned somewhat cast down. Mrs. Harrison was away. She's gone to Carmody with Mrs. Rachel Lynde to get new paper for the parlor, and Mr. Harrison said to tell Anne to go over and see him 'cause he wants to have a talk with her. And say, the floor is scrubbed, and Mr. Harrison is shaved, though there wasn't any preaching yesterday. The Harrison kitchen wore a very unfamiliar look to Anne. The floor was indeed scrubbed to a wonderful pitch of purity, and so was every article of furniture in the room. The stove was polished until she could see her face in it. The walls were whitewashed, and the window panes sparkled in the sunlight. By the table sat Mr. Harrison in his working clothes, which on Friday had been noted for sundry rents and taters, but which now were neatly patched and brushed. He was sprucely shaved, and what little hair he had was carefully trimmed. Sit down, Anne, sit down, said Mr. Harrison in a tone but 2 degrees removed from that which Avonlea people used at funerals. Emily's gone over to Carmody with Rachel Lynde. She's struck up a lifelong friendship already with Rachel Lynde. Beats me, beats all, how contrary women are. Well, Anne, my easy times are over, all over. It's neatness and tidiness for me for the rest of my natural life, I suppose. Mr. Harrison did his best to speak dolefully, but an irrepressible twinkle in his eye betrayed him. Mr. Harrison, you're glad your wife has come back, cried Anne, shaking her finger at him. You needn't pretend you're not, because I can see it plainly. Mr. Harrison relaxed into a sheepish smile. Well, I'm getting used to it, he conceded. I can't say I was sorry to see Emily. A man really needs some protection in a community like this, where he can't play a game of checkers with a neighbor without being accused of wanting to marry that neighbor's sister and having it put in the paper. Nobody would have supposed you went to Isabella Andrews if you hadn't pretended to be unmarried, said Anne severely. I didn't pretend I was. If anybody had asked me if I was married, I'd have said I was. But they just took it for granted. I wasn't anxious to talk about the matter. I was feeling too sore over it. It would have been nuts for Mrs. Rachel Lynde if she had known my wife had left me, wouldn't it now? But some people say that you left her. She started it, Anne. She started it. I'm going to tell you the whole story, for I don't want you to think worse of me than I deserve, nor of Emily neither. But let's go out on the veranda. Everything is so fearful neat in here that kind of makes me homesick. I suppose I'll get used to it after a while, but it eases me to look at the yard. Emily hasn't had time to tidy it up yet. As soon as they were comfortably seated on the veranda, Mr. Harrison began his tale of woe. Wet the whistle. Tale of woe. I lived in Scottsford, New Brunswick, before I came here, Anne. My sister kept house for me, and she suited me fine. She was just reasonably tidy, and she let me alone and spoiled me, so Emily says. But 3 years ago, she died. Before she died, she worried a lot about what was to become of me, and finally she got me to promise I'd get married. She advised me to take Emily Scott because Emily had money of her own and was a pattern housekeeper. I said, says I, Emily Scott wouldn't look at me. You ask her and see, says my sister, and just to ease her mind, I promised her I would, and I did. And Emily said she'd have me. Never was I so surprised in my life, and a smart, pretty woman like her and an old fellow like me. I tell you, I thought at first I was in luck. Well, we were married and took a little wedding trip to St. John for a fortnight, and then we went home. We got home at 10 o'clock at night, and I give you my word, Anne, that in half an hour that woman was at work cleaning. Oh, I know you're thinking my house needed it. You've got a very expressive face, Anne. Your thoughts just come out on it like print. But it didn't, not that bad. It had got pretty mixed up while I was keeping bachelor's hall, I admit. But I'd got a woman to come in and clean it before I was married, and there'd been considerable painting and fixing done. I tell you, if you took Emily into a brand new white marble palace, she'd be into the scrubbing as soon as she could get an old dress on. Well, she cleaned the house till 1 o'clock that night, and at 4 she was up and at it again, and she kept on that way. Far as I could see, she never stopped. It was scour and sweep, dust everlasting, except on Sundays. And then she was just longing for Monday to begin again. But it was her way of amusing herself, and I could have reconciled myself to it if she'd left me alone. But that she wouldn't do. She'd set out to make me over, but she hadn't caught me young again. I wasn't allowed to come into the house unless I changed my boots for slippers at the door. I darsn't smoke a pipe for my life unless I went to the barn, and I didn't use good enough grammar. Emily had been a school teacher in her early life, and she'd never got over it. Then she hated to see me eating with my knife. Well, there it was, pick and nag everlasting. But I suppose, Anne, to be fair, I was cantankerous too. I didn't try to improve as I might have done. I just got cranky and disagreeable when she found fault. I told her one day she hadn't complained of my grammar when I proposed to her. It wasn't an overly tactful thing to say. A woman would forgive a man for beating her sooner than for hinting she was too much pleased to get him. Well, we bickered along like that, and it wasn't exactly pleasant, but we might have got used to it each other's we might have got used to each other after a spell if it hadn't been for Ginger. Ginger was the rock we split on at last. Emily didn't like parrots, and she couldn't stand Ginger's profane habits of speech. I was attached to the bird for my brother, the sailor's sake. My brother, the parrot, was a pet of mine when we were little tads, and he had sent Ginger to me when he was dying. I didn't see any sense in getting worked up over his swearing. There's nothing I hate worse than profanity in a human being, but in a parrot, they're just repeating what is heard, with no more understanding of it than I'd have if Chinese allowances might be made. But Emily couldn't see it that way. Women ain't logical. She tried to break Ginger of swearing, but she hadn't any better success than she had trying to make me stop saying I seen. Oh, that drives me crazy. My mama used to do that all the time. And them things. Seemed as if the more she tried, the worse Ginger got. Same as me. Well, things went on like this, both of us getting raspier till the climax came. Emily invited our minister and his wife to tea, and another minister and his wife that was visiting them. I'd promised to put Ginger away in some safe place where nobody would hear him. Emily wouldn't touch his cage with a 10-foot pole, and I meant to do it, for I didn't want the ministers to hear anything unpleasant in my house, but it slipped my mind. Emily was worrying me so much about my clean clothes and grammar that it wasn't any wonder, and I never thought of that poor parrot till we sat down to eat. Just as minister number one was in the very middle of saying grace, Ginger, who was on the veranda outside the dining room window, lifted up his voice. The gobbler had come into view in the yard, and the sight of the gobbler always had an unwholesome effect on Ginger. He surpassed himself that time. You can smile, Anne, and don't deny. I've chuckled some over it since then, but at the time I felt almost as much mortified as Emily. We went out. Hang on. As Emily. I went out and carried Ginger to the barn. I can't say I enjoyed the meal. I knew by the look of Emily that there was trouble brewing for Ginger and James. When the folks went away, I started for the cow pasture, and on the way I did some thinking.